Picture this. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stands on a dusty hillside in southeastern Turkey in October of 1994, squinting against the brutal Anatolian sun as it beats down on a landscape so barren and unremarkable that 1,000 tourists could pass through this region without giving it a second glance. And yet he finds himself unable to shake the feeling that something profound lies beneath his feet, something that whispers to him through the layers of dirt and time and forgotten memory. He kicks at what appears to be just another limestone fragment, jutting from the earth. The kind of rock you'd step over without thinking during a casual hike. Except this particular stone refuses to behave like the random geological debris it should be. And when Schmidt bends down to examine it more closely, brushing away 11,000 years of accumulated soil with hands that have excavated dozens of ancient sites across the Middle East, he realizes with a jolt of recognition that shoots through his body like electricity, that this isn't a natural formation at all, but rather something carved, something shaped, something that absolutely should not exist in this place or in this time, or according to anything that modern archaeology has spent the last century teaching us about the development of human civilization. The local farmers have known about this hill, called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly to Potbelly Hill in Turkish, a name so mundane it seems almost insulting given what actually lurks beneath. For generations, and they've always assumed it was nothing more than an old Byzantine cemetery, perhaps a place where medieval Christians buried their dead before moving on to other lands, leaving behind only these limestone fragments as markers of forgotten lives. But Schmidt, who has spent years studying the megalithic structures of Europe and the ancient settlements of the Near East, recognizes immediately that what he's looking at predates Byzantine. Civilization by thousands of years predates the rise of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, predates even the earliest farming villages that textbooks confidently declare to be the birthplace of complex human society. And as he begins to carefully excavate around this first stone, revealing its full T-shaped form standing nearly 6 feet tall, he understands with a certainty that makes his hands tremble slightly that he's stumbled upon something that will force every archaeologist, every historian, every anthropologist in the world to fundamentally reconsider what they think they know about humanity's journey from small bands of hunter-gatherers to the builders of cities and temples and civilizations. The initial excavations reveal something so staggering in its implications that Schmidt will spend the rest of his life, until his death in 2014, trying to make sense of what he's uncovered. Because Göbekli Tepe isn't just old, it's impossibly ancient. Radiocarbon dated to approximately 9600 BCE, which means it was constructed more than 11,000 years ago when, according to everything we've been taught, humans were still living as nomadic hunter-gatherers who survived by following herds of wild animals and gathering whatever edible plants they could find in the wilderness. To put this timeline in perspective, imagine that you're standing at Stonehenge, that iconic ring of massive stones on England's Salisbury Plain that has captivated human imagination for centuries. And you're trying to comprehend its age, its mystery, its connection to ancient peoples we barely understand. And then someone tells you that Göbekli Tepe was already ancient when Stonehenge was built. That in fact Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, which is roughly the same amount of time that separates us today from the construction of the first Egyptian pyramids. The pyramids of Giza, those monuments we think of as impossibly old, as relics from the very dawn of human achievement, would have been cutting-edge modern architecture compared to Göbekli Tepe. Because the Turkish site was already buried and forgotten under centuries of accumulated earth, by the time the first pharaohs were dreaming of their eternal tombs along the Nile. What makes this discovery even more mind-bending is understanding what the world supposedly looked like in 9600 BCE, a time that exists so far back in human prehistory that we have no written records, no historical accounts, nothing but archaeological evidence and educated guesses to tell us how our ancestors lived and thought and organized their societies. This was the tail end of the last ice age, a period when massive glaciers still covered much of Europe and North America, when woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats still roamed the earth, when the English Channel didn't exist yet because Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge that wouldn't be flooded by rising seas for another 1,000 years. The people living in this era were supposed to be simple, their lives consumed by the daily struggle for survival, their technology limited to stone tools and animal skins, their social organization extending no further than small family groups, or perhaps bands of a few dozen individuals who moved seasonally following the migration patterns of the animals they hunted and the ripening cycles of the wild plants they gathered. These were not people who built monuments, because monuments require surplus resources, require large numbers of workers who can be fed while they're engaged in construction, rather than food procurement, require organizational systems to coordinate labor, require some kind of shared vision or belief system, powerful enough to motivate people to spend years moving massive stones instead of simply trying to survive another winter. And yet here at Göbekli Tepe, Schmidt and his team uncover not just one or two carved pillars, but dozens above them, arranged in circular enclosures that clearly followed some kind of architectural plan, some kind of shared design principle that governed their construction. And these aren't crude rocks stacked haphazardly on top of each other, like the kind of simple shelter you might build to escape a rainstorm. These are massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them weighing 20 tons or more, quarried from bedrock located about a quarter-mile away from the main site, and somehow transported across the landscape and erected upright in precisely arranged circles. Their surfaces covered with intricate bas-relief carvings of animals, scorpions with their tails raised in threat, foxes and wild boars and gazelles, vultures with outstretched wings, snakes slithering across the stone, bulls with horns lowered as if charging an invisible enemy, and strange abstract symbols whose meanings remain maddeningly opaque even after decades of study. The level of artistry on display here isn't primitive or crude, but rather sophisticated and confident, executed by people who clearly had developed techniques for carving hard limestone with remarkable precision, despite having access only to stone tools, and the consistency of the style across multiple structures suggests not just individual artistic expression, but rather a shared cultural tradition, a common visual language that implies these builders were communicating complex ideas about their world, their beliefs, their understanding of the cosmos, and their place within it. Walking among these pillars today, or at least among the small percentage that has been excavated, because the vast majority of Göbekli Tepe still lies buried beneath the earth, waiting for future archaeologists with better tools and better funding to reveal its secrets. You can't help but feel the weight of all the assumptions that this place has shattered into dust. For more than a century, the narrative of human development has been straightforward and linear, a comforting story of progress from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized. And it goes something like this. First, sometime around 10,000 BCE, in the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East, some clever humans figured out that instead of gathering wild grain, they could deliberately plant seeds and harvest crops, which we call the agricultural revolution. This agricultural surplus allowed people to settle down in permanent villages instead of constantly moving around. And these permanent settlements led to specialization of labor, which led to technological innovation, which led to the development of writing and mathematics, and organized religion, and all the other hallmarks of what we call civilization, eventually culminating in the great cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the other ancient empires that arose thousands of years later. It's a tidy progression, a story that makes sense, a narrative that places agriculture as the foundation upon which everything else was built, because how could you have civilization without farming? Without the food surplus that allows some people to become priests and artists and architects, instead of everyone spending every day hunting and gathering just to survive. Göbekli Tepe takes this entire narrative and sets it on fire, because here we have monumental architecture, organized labor on a massive scale, sophisticated artistic traditions, and what appears to be complex religious or ceremonial practice, all happening before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before any of the things that were supposed to make such achievements possible. It's like finding a fully functional iPhone buried in layers of earth that date to the Roman Empire, or discovering that medieval peasants had somehow invented the internet centuries before electricity was harnessed, or uncovering evidence that Neanderthals were building space shuttles. It's that level of chronological impossibility, that degree of fundamental contradiction to everything the experts have confidently told us about how human civilization developed. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community because it meant that textbooks had to be rewritten, that comfortable theories had to be abandoned or heavily revised, that the simple, linear progression from primitive to advanced was revealed to be far more complicated and messy than anyone had imagined. And perhaps most humbling of all, it meant acknowledging that we had been looking at evidence of this sophisticated prehistoric culture for decades without recognizing it for what it was. Because here's the truly embarrassing part of this story. Göbekli Tepe wasn't completely unknown before Schmidt's 1994 revelation. And in fact, archaeologists from the University of Chicago had surveyed the site back in the 1960s, had noted the presence of worked stone and unusual formations, and had concluded, incorrectly, disastrously, in a decision that would delay our understanding of human prehistory by 30 years, that it was nothing more than a Byzantine cemetery, and therefore not worth further investigation. They looked directly at evidence that contradicted the entire established chronology of human development, and they dismissed it, filed it away, moved on to other sites that fit more comfortably within existing theoretical frameworks. And this failure of imagination, this inability to see what was right in front of them because it didn't match what they expected to find, serves as a powerful reminder of how our assumptions can blind us to revolutionary discoveries, even when we're literally standing on top of them. It makes you wonder what else might be out there, still buried, still waiting, dismissed as impossible by experts who can't conceive of a reality different from the one described in their textbooks. And it raises the unsettling question of how many times throughout history we've looked at evidence of human capability and sophistication and told ourselves it couldn't be real, simply because it didn't fit our preconceived notions about what ancient people were capable of achieving. As Schmidt and his team continued excavating through the 1990s and 2000s, the site only became more impressive and more mysterious, revealing layer upon layer of circular enclosures, each one containing multiple massive pillars arranged in patterns that clearly held some significance to their builders, and the more they uncovered, the more questions arose about who these people were, how they organized themselves, what motivated them to undertake such an enormous construction project, and what it all meant. The implications of Göbekli Tepe extend far beyond simply pushing back the date of monumental architecture by a few thousand years. Because if hunter-gatherers could build something this complex, this permanent, this symbolic and ceremonial, then perhaps they weren't the simple, survival-focused nomads we've always imagined them to be. And perhaps the division between primitive hunter-gatherers and civilized agricultural societies is far more blurred and artificial than we've wanted to admit. And perhaps, most provocatively, our ancestors 11,000 years ago possessed knowledge and capabilities and social structures that we've consistently underestimated because we've been too arrogant to imagine that people without our technology could achieve something we'd struggle to replicate even today. The question that haunts anyone who stands among these ancient stones, feeling the wind that has blown across this Turkish plateau for millennia, is not really about dates or timelines or archaeological classifications, but rather something more fundamental and more disturbing to our modern sense of superiority. If they could do this with nothing but stone tools and human muscle and sheer determination, what else were they capable of? And how much of our prehistoric past have we simply lost to time, buried under the accumulated debris of ages, waiting for someone brave enough, or lucky enough, or stubborn enough to dig down through our assumptions and uncover the truth that lies beneath? If you've ever attempted to move a particularly heavy piece of furniture, say a solid oak dresser or an overstuffed couch, up a narrow staircase and into a third-floor apartment, you know the unique combination of physical exhaustion, strategic planning, and occasional bursts of profanity that such an endeavor requires. And you've probably found yourself wondering why furniture manufacturers seem to take sadistic pleasure in creating pieces that are just slightly too wide for standard doorways, or just heavy enough to make you question every life decision that led to this moment. Now, take that experience and multiply the difficulty by approximately 1,000. Remove all modern conveniences like wheels and pulleys and metal tools. Subtract any possibility of using draft animals like horses or oxen because they haven't been domesticated yet. Eliminate the option of hiring professional movers or even consulting a how-to video on the internet. And instead of moving your couch up 3 flights of stairs, imagine transporting a carved limestone pillar that weighs 20 tons, roughly equivalent to the weight of 4 adult African elephants or 3 fully loaded cement trucks, across a quarter-mile of rough terrain, and then somehow hoisting it into an upright position with such precision that it aligns perfectly with celestial bodies and maintains that alignment for the next 11,000 years. And you begin to get a sense of the absolutely insane engineering challenge that the builders of Göbekli Tepe faced every single day of their construction project. The pillars themselves present a problem that modern engineers, equipped with computer modeling software and materials, science degrees, and a comprehensive understanding of physics, find genuinely difficult to solve even in theory, because these aren't simple standing stones like you might find scattered across the European countryside. Rough-hewn monuments that could conceivably be shaped through patient percussion with stone hammers over weeks or months. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe are sophisticated architectural elements, carved from solid bedrock in limestone quarries located about 1,300 feet from the main construction site. Their surfaces smoothed and shaped with remarkable precision, their distinctive T-shape requiring the removal of enormous quantities of stone material to create the horizontal arms that top each pillar like a massive stone mushroom, or an abstract representation of a human torso with outstretched arms. And this distinctive shape wasn't just an aesthetic choice, but rather a functional design that allowed the pillars to support massive stone roofing blocks that may have once covered the circular enclosures, creating enclosed spaces for whatever rituals or ceremonies took place within these ancient structures. The largest of these pillars stand more than 16 feet tall and weigh an estimated 20 tons, dimensions that would be impressive even for modern construction projects. Utilizing cranes and hydraulic equipment and computer-controlled cutting tools. And yet somehow, people who had never seen a metal blade, never harnessed electricity, never discovered the wheel, let alone invented the crane or the pulley system or any of the mechanical advantages that make modern construction possible, managed to quarry these massive stones, shape them with incredible precision, transport them across rough and uneven terrain, and erect them in carefully planned circular arrangements that have survived everything that 11 millennia of earthquakes, weather, and geological shifts could throw at them. The quarrying process alone represents an engineering puzzle that has occupied researchers for decades, because removing a 20-ton block of limestone from solid bedrock requires either enormous patience or enormous force. And the builders of Göbekli Tepe had access to neither explosives nor metal tools that could efficiently cut through stone, leaving them with only the most primitive technology imaginable. Stone-pounding stones, stone wedges, stone hammers, and an unlimited supply of time and determination. The most likely technique, based on experimental archaeology conducted by researchers attempting to recreate ancient stoneworking methods, involved creating a series of holes along the desired cutting line using pointed stone tools and enormous amounts of repetitive pounding, then driving wooden or stone wedges into these holes and perhaps soaking the wooden wedges with water so they would expand and create enough pressure to crack the limestone along the predetermined line. A process that would have required weeks or even months of constant labor for a single pillar, and this assumes that the workers had extensive knowledge of stone grain patterns and fracture mechanics, the kind of expertise that supposedly doesn't develop until civilizations have been working with stone for generations, not among people who were allegedly still figuring out the basic principles of settled existence. Once a pillar had been successfully separated from the bedrock, the real nightmare began, because now you have a 20-ton piece of carved limestone that needs to be moved 1,300 feet uphill to the construction site. And every single option for accomplishing this task seems to range from incredibly difficult to physically impossible when you consider the technological limitations of the era. Modern attempts to recreate the transportation methods available to Neolithic builders have produced results that are simultaneously encouraging and deeply unsettling. Because while it's theoretically possible to move massive stones using only human power, wooden rollers, rope made from plant fibers, and perhaps stone sledges that could slide across the ground when lubricated with water or animal fat, the practical requirements for such an endeavor stretch the bounds of credibility when applied to a supposedly primitive hunter-gatherer society. To move a 20-ton stone using these primitive methods would require somewhere between 200 and 500 people pulling in coordinated unison, and this calculation assumes optimal conditions: relatively flat ground, well-maintained wooden rollers that don't snap under the immense weight, rope that doesn't fray and break after hours of friction and tension, and most improbably of all, several hundred people who are well fed enough to perform this kind of back-breaking physical labor for hours or days at a time, and who are organized and coordinated enough to pull together on command without the benefit of written instructions or mechanical timing devices, or even a shared language that we know of. The logistical nightmare of feeding several hundred laborers while they're engaged in construction rather than hunting and gathering their own food, represents a problem that, according to traditional archaeological theory, shouldn't have a solution in 9600 BCE, because food surplus sufficient to support large-scale specialized labor is supposed to be a product of agriculture, which hadn't been invented yet, or at least hadn't been invented in this region at this time, which creates a circular paradox that makes your head hurt if you think about it too carefully. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that somehow the builders managed to solve the food problem and the coordination problem and successfully transported their massive pillars to the construction site without anyone getting crushed when a rope snapped or a roller shattered under the immense weight. You now face the even more daunting challenge of getting these multi-ton stones into an upright position with enough precision that they not only stand securely in their designated spots, but also align with each other in perfect circles and, in some cases, align with astronomical phenomena, like the summer solstice sunrise, or specific star patterns that the builders apparently cared deeply about tracking. The standard method for erecting large stones, which has been observed in various cultures from the builders of Stonehenge to the creators of Easter Island's famous Moai statues, involves digging a hole, tipping the stone into the hole so it slides into an upright position, and then backfilling the hole with smaller rocks and debris to hold the pillar stable. But this technique requires the hole to be precisely the right depth and shape, requires the pillar to be positioned at exactly the right angle before tipping, and requires an enormous amount of force applied at precisely the right moment to get the stone moving from horizontal to vertical without it toppling over or cracking or crushing, the workers attempting to control its movement. Some researchers have suggested that the builders might have used earthen ramps, gradually raising the stones using a combination of leverage and brute force, while others propose more elaborate systems involving wooden scaffolding or counterweights. But all of these techniques require engineering knowledge, mathematical understanding, and practical experience that, once again, supposedly didn't exist in 9600 BCE. Among people who were just starting to experiment with cultivating wild grains and hadn't yet figured out how to make pottery or domesticate animals or build permanent houses with foundations. The precision of the final result only deepens the mystery, because when you examine the circular enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, you find that the pillars aren't just randomly placed in roughly circular patterns, but rather positioned with geometric accuracy that suggests the use of measuring devices, planning tools, and mathematical concepts that we have no evidence these people possessed, and the alignment of certain pillars with celestial bodies implies not only astronomical knowledge, but also the ability to track and predict celestial movements over long periods of time, the kind of sustained observation and record-keeping that requires either a literate culture capable of writing down observations, or an oral tradition so robust and precise that it could transmit complex astronomical data across generations without degradation or loss of accuracy. Some of the pillars feature carved markings that researchers have interpreted as possible lunar calendars or star maps, abstract symbols arranged in patterns that might encode sophisticated mathematical or astronomical information. And if these interpretations are correct, then we're looking at evidence of scientific thinking and systematic observation of natural phenomena emerging thousands of years before the Sumerians invented cuneiform writing, or the Egyptians developed hieroglyphics, which were supposed to be humanity's first attempts at recording and transmitting complex information across time and space. The carvings themselves present yet another engineering challenge that strains our understanding of what Stone Age technology could accomplish. because these aren't crude stick figures scratched into soft stone, but rather detailed, lifelike representations of animals carved in bas relief, a technique that requires removing the surrounding stone material to make the carved image stand out from the background. And some of these carvings feature details so fine and precise. The individual feathers on a vulture's wing, the scales on a snake's body, the bristles on a boar's back, that they must have required specialized tools and extraordinary skill to execute. Creating this level of detail in hard limestone using only stone tools would be like trying to perform delicate surgery using only a butter knife and a hammer. Theoretically possible if you're incredibly skilled and incredibly patient, but so difficult and time-consuming that you have to wonder why anyone would bother unless the symbolic or religious significance of these images was powerful enough to justify the enormous investment of labor and expertise required to create them. The consistency of artistic style across multiple structures and across what appears to be several generations of construction suggests that this wasn't just individual artists expressing personal visions, but rather trained craftspeople working within an established tradition, following specific conventions and techniques that had been developed and refined over time. And the existence of such artistic traditions implies social structures complex enough to support specialized training, aesthetic standards shared across the community, and the transmission of technical knowledge from master craftspeople to apprentices, none of which is supposed to exist in hunter-gatherer societies that supposedly lacked the social complexity or economic surplus to support specialized labor. When modern structural engineers examine Göbekli Tepe and attempt to calculate the labor investment required to build it, they arrive at estimates that are simultaneously impressive and deeply troubling for our understanding of Neolithic society, because the numbers suggest that constructing even a single circular enclosure would have required thousands of person-hours of labor spread across decades. And since the site contains at least 20 such enclosures built over approximately a 1,000-year period, we're looking at a sustained construction project that would have demanded the coordinated effort of potentially thousands of people across dozens of generations, all working toward a common goal based on a shared vision that remained consistent enough across centuries to produce architectural elements that follow the same basic design principles throughout the site's occupation. This level of multi-generational coordination and commitment to a single purpose is extraordinary, even by the standards of later civilizations with written languages and centralized governments and professional administrative bureaucracies, so discovering it in a supposedly primitive Neolithic society forces us to completely reconsider our assumptions about what hunter-gatherers were capable of organizing and what could motivate them to undertake construction projects that would consume resources and labor for longer than any individual participant would live to see completed. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the engineering achievement at Göbekli Tepe is the realization that the oldest structures at the site, the ones buried deepest in the earth, constructed earliest in the site's 1,000-year history, are actually the most sophisticated, the most precisely constructed, the most elaborately decorated, while the later structures show a gradual decline in both size and artistic quality, as if the builders were slowly forgetting how to execute the techniques that their ancestors had mastered. And this backward progression, this devolution from complex to simple, rather than the expected evolution from simple to complex, suggests that we might be looking at the tail end of a knowledge tradition rather than its beginning, that perhaps the people who built Gobekli Tepe had inherited their expertise from even earlier cultures about which we know nothing, and that what we're seeing at this Turkish hillside is not the birth of human architectural achievement, but rather its last flowering before some catastrophe or cultural shift caused this knowledge to be lost, buried under the earth along with the massive stones that embody it. The question that emerges from examining the sheer engineering impossibility of Göbekli Tepe is not merely how they built it, though that remains genuinely puzzling even after decades of research, but rather what else they might have been capable of building. What other structures might still lie buried under 11,000 years of accumulated soil and sediment, waiting to further upend our comfortable assumptions about the capabilities and achievements of our supposedly primitive ancestors, and whether our failure to find more evidence of this sophisticated prehistoric culture is because it doesn't exist, or because we haven't been looking in the right places, or asking the right questions, or entertaining the possibility that human history might be far stranger and more complex than the simple linear narrative we've constructed to explain our journey from caves to civilization. Standing among the massive T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe today, surrounded by stone monuments that have weathered 11,000 years of wind and rain and the slow, grinding passage of geological time, you find yourself confronted with a question that gnaws at the edges of rational explanation and refuses to be satisfied by the comfortable academic theories that archaeologists have constructed to make sense of this impossible place. And that question is perhaps the most fundamentally human inquiry we can ask about any ancient structure. Why did they build this? It's the same question that echoes through every encounter with monumental architecture from the past. Why did the Egyptians invest generations of labor into constructing massive pyramids? Why did medieval Europeans pour centuries of resources into building soaring cathedrals? Why did the people of Easter Island carve and transport hundreds of massive stone heads across their isolated island? But at Göbekli Tepe, the question carries an extra weight of mystery and confusion, because unlike pyramids that served as royal tombs, or cathedrals that housed Christian worship, or moai that embodied ancestral spirits, this Turkish site shows absolutely no evidence of the utilitarian purposes that usually accompany monumental construction. There are no houses here, no evidence of permanent habitation, no trash heaps filled with the broken pottery and animal bones, and discarded tools that accumulate wherever humans settle down and make a home. No cooking fires that would indicate regular meal preparation. No storage facilities for grain or other foodstuffs. No fortifications to protect against enemies. No evidence whatsoever that anyone actually lived at Göbekli Tepe, despite the enormous investment of labor required to build it. And this absence of practical function, this dedication of massive resources to creating something that appears to serve no survival-related purpose whatsoever, forces us to confront the possibility that the people who built this place were motivated by something we struggle to understand from our modern, materialistic perspective. Something intangible, something symbolic, something that existed primarily in the realm of ideas and beliefs and collective imagination, rather than in the practical world of food and shelter and protection from predators. The prevailing theory among mainstream archaeologists, the explanation that has gained the most traction in academic circles and appears in most documentaries and museum exhibitions about Göbekli Tepe, is that this was a temple complex, a sacred space dedicated to religious rituals and ceremonies, a place where Neolithic hunter-gatherers gathered periodically to worship gods or spirits or forces of nature whose names have been lost to time, but whose importance was apparently profound enough to motivate the construction of one of the most ambitious architectural projects in human history. But pause for a moment and really consider what this theory implies about the development of human culture and consciousness. Because if Gobekli Tepe was indeed a religious site, and the evidence does seem to point in that direction, with its elaborate animal symbolism and celestial alignments and complete lack of practical function, suggesting a purpose that was ceremonial rather than utilitarian. Then we're forced to acknowledge that complex religious thought, sophisticated enough to inspire the organization of massive construction projects, existed among humans before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before any of the developments that we've traditionally associated with the rise of civilization. And this completely inverts the comfortable narrative that has dominated archaeological thinking for the past century. The story that says agriculture came first and created the food surplus that allowed some people to become priests and artists, instead of everyone spending their days hunting and gathering. And that settled village life came next and created the social complexity that led to organized religion and shared cosmologies and all the other cultural achievements that we lump together under the heading of civilization. Göbekli Tepe suggests instead that the causation might run in precisely the opposite direction, that perhaps organized religion, or at least the kind of shared belief system powerful enough to motivate hundreds of people to cooperate on a construction project spanning decades, came first and actually drove the development of agriculture and settled life. Because if you're gathering periodically at a sacred site for rituals and ceremonies and feasting, you need a reliable food supply nearby to feed all those pilgrims and worshippers. And the easiest way to ensure such a food supply is to start deliberately cultivating the wild grains and pulses that grow naturally in this region of southeastern Turkey, which happens to be part of the Fertile Crescent where agriculture is believed to have originated. Though now we have to wonder whether that origin was less about practical survival strategies and more about the need to support religious gatherings at places like Göbekli Tepe. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who devoted the last 2 decades of his life to excavating and interpreting this site, became convinced that Gobekli Tepe represented nothing less than the birthplace of organized religion, the place where humans first began constructing elaborate symbolic systems to explain their relationship to the cosmos and to each other. And while we can never know for certain what rituals took place among these stone pillars, or what gods or spirits were worshipped here, or what cosmological understanding motivated the builders to align certain structures with celestial phenomena, the very existence of this place forces us to acknowledge that the people who built it possessed an interior life, a capacity for abstract thought and symbolic reasoning and collective imagination that rivals anything produced by the supposedly more advanced civilizations that would emerge thousands of years later. But the temple theory, while compelling and supported by considerable archaeological evidence, doesn't fully satisfy everyone who has studied Göbekli Tepe. And some researchers have proposed alternative explanations that emphasize different aspects of the site's possible function, including the intriguing suggestion that this might have served as a gathering place for different hunter-gatherer bands, a kind of Stone Age convention center or festival ground where disparate groups who normally roamed separate territories came together periodically for purposes that were simultaneously sacred and profane, spiritual and social, religious and practical. The evidence supporting this interpretation includes the discovery of enormous quantities of animal bones at the site, particularly the bones of gazelles and wild cattle and other game animals, which seem to have been consumed in massive feasting events that would have required the slaughter of hundreds or even thousands of animals at a time. And the scale of these feasts suggests gatherings that brought together far more people than could belong to a single hunter-gatherer band, implying instead regional or even inter-regional congregations where people from dozens or hundreds of miles around converged on this sacred hillside for celebrations that combined religious ceremony with social networking, where marriages might be arranged between different groups, where knowledge and stories and technological innovations could be shared, where trade goods could be exchanged, and where the bonds of a larger cultural identity could be reinforced through shared rituals and collective participation in ceremonies that reaffirmed everyone's connection to the sacred landscape and to each other. Imagine, if you will, something like the Burning Man Festival of contemporary Nevada, that annual gathering where tens of thousands of people converge on the Black Rock Desert to create a temporary city dedicated to art and community and shared experience. Except instead of happening in the desert, it takes place on a Turkish hillside. And instead of RVs and electronic music and elaborate art installations, you have animal skin, tents and drumming and massive stone pillars carved with the images of the animals and birds, and mysterious symbols that populate the spiritual landscape of Neolithic consciousness. And instead of lasting for a week, it might have gone on for months during certain seasons of the year, when game was plentiful and wild plants were abundant. And different hunter-gatherer groups could afford to take time away from the constant work of survival to gather together for celebrations that fed both their bodies and their souls. The astronomical aspects of Göbekli Tepe add another layer of possible function to this already complex picture, because several of the pillars and enclosures show alignments with celestial phenomena: the summer solstice sunrise, certain star patterns, possibly the position of the constellation we now call Orion's Belt. Though the names and meanings these ancient people attached to these stellar patterns are lost to us, across the vast gulf of time that separates our worldview from theirs. And these alignments suggest that the site might have served, among its other purposes, as an observatory for tracking the movements of the heavens, a place where careful observers could mark the changing seasons, predict the annual flooding of rivers, or the migration of animal herds, or the ripening of wild fruit and grain. Knowledge that would have been invaluable for hunter-gatherer groups trying to optimize their seasonal movements and food-gathering strategies. But here again we encounter that troubling chicken and egg problem, because astronomical observations sophisticated enough to align massive stone structures with celestial events requires sustained attention over many years, requires the ability to recognize and remember patterns in the night sky, requires some system for recording or transmitting observations across generations so that the knowledge doesn't die when the original observers pass away. And all of this implies a level of intellectual organization and cultural continuity that supposedly doesn't emerge until much later in human history, when writing systems and professional priesthoods and institutional structures exist to preserve and transmit specialized knowledge. The presence of what might be astronomical symbols carved into the pillars, abstract geometric patterns that some researchers have interpreted as possible star charts or lunar calendars, though such interpretations remain controversial and highly speculative, suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe had developed some method of encoding their observations in stone, creating a permanent record that could outlast any individual human life and serve as a reference for future generations trying to maintain and expand the astronomical knowledge that their ancestors had accumulated. And if this interpretation is correct, then we're looking at a form of proto-writing, a system for preserving information in durable form, emerging thousands of years before. The Sumerians invented cuneiform, or the Egyptians developed hieroglyphics, those writing systems that we've always considered humanity's first attempts at creating permanent records of knowledge and memory. The question of what motivated the builders of Göbekli Tepe becomes even more perplexing when you consider the sheer scale and duration of the construction project. Because this wasn't something that could be completed in a single season or even a single lifetime, but rather a multi-generational undertaking that consumed the labor and resources of countless individuals across approximately 1,000 years. And maintaining that kind of sustained commitment to a construction project requires either an extraordinarily powerful shared belief system or an extraordinarily effective system of social organization and leadership, neither of which is supposed to exist among the supposedly egalitarian and loosely organized hunter-gatherer bands that populated this region in the 10th millennium BCE. Some researchers have suggested that the construction of Göbekli Tepe itself might have been the point, that the process of gathering together to build these monuments was as important as, or even more important, than the finished product, because the act of construction would have required cooperation and coordination on an unprecedented scale, would have brought together people from different groups who might otherwise have had limited contact, would have created a shared sense of accomplishment and collective identity, and would have served as a kind of social glue binding together disparate hunter-gatherer communities into a larger cultural unit capable of undertaking projects that no single band could accomplish alone. In this interpretation, Göbekli Tepe becomes less like a cathedral built to house worship services, and more like a medieval European cathedral construction project, where the building process itself was understood to be a form of devotion, and where the laborers who would never live to see the finished structure nevertheless found meaning and purpose in contributing their small part to a grand enterprise that would outlast them by centuries. But perhaps the most unsettling implication of Göbekli Tepe's existence is the possibility that we've had the entire trajectory of human cultural development backwards, that instead of practical concerns driving cultural evolution, agriculture leading to settlement, leading to surplus, leading to specialization, leading to art and religion and monumental architecture, it might actually be the other way around, with abstract ideas and symbolic thinking and religious imagination serving as the primary drivers of human innovation and social organization, pushing our ancestors to develop new technologies and new forms of cooperation, not because they needed them to survive, but because they needed them to express and act upon ideas that existed primarily in the realm of belief and imagination and shared cosmology. Think about what this means for how we understand ourselves and our history. Because if Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that humans were building elaborate symbolic structures to express religious or cosmological ideas before they had figured out how to farm or build permanent houses or make pottery, then perhaps the thing that makes us distinctively human isn't our tool use or our language or our ability to cooperate in large groups, but rather our capacity for believing in things we cannot see. Our need to impose meaning and order on a chaotic universe through symbols and rituals and monuments that embody our deepest convictions about the nature of reality. And perhaps this capacity for abstract, symbolic thought is what actually drove all the other innovations that we associate with civilization. Because once you believe that certain places are sacred, or certain times are auspicious, or certain patterns in the stars carry divine messages, you're motivated to develop the technologies and organizational structures necessary to act on those beliefs, to build temples aligned with celestial events, to gather in large numbers for seasonal ceremonies, to create permanent records of astronomical observations, to establish systems for training. Priests or shamans or astronomical observers, and gradually, almost accidentally, you find yourself inventing agriculture and writing and mathematics and all the other hallmarks of civilization, not because you set out to create civilization, but because you needed these tools to properly honor the gods or spirits or cosmic forces that populated your imaginative landscape. The animals carved into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe offer tantalizing hints about the symbolic universe that motivated its construction. Because these aren't just random fauna sculpted for decorative purposes, but rather a carefully curated menagerie that appears repeatedly across different structures and seems to carry specific symbolic meanings that we can only dimly perceive across the vast chronological distance that separates us from the people who created them. Scorpions with raised tails suggesting threat or danger. Vultures with outstretched wings that might represent death or transition, or the connection between earth and sky. Foxes that could symbolize cunning or transformation, or the wild, untamed landscape beyond human control. Bulls and wild boars representing strength and ferocity, and the dangerous power of nature that humans must respect and appease. Snakes that in almost every culture symbolize renewal and transformation, and the mysterious forces that govern life and death and rebirth. And scattered among these recognizable creatures are abstract symbols and geometric patterns, whose meanings remain completely opaque to modern researchers. Encrypted messages from a culture so different from our own that we lack even the basic conceptual vocabulary to begin decoding what they meant to the people who carved them into stone with such evident care and precision. The prominence of predators and dangerous animals in the iconography has led some researchers to suggest that Göbekli Tepe might have been dedicated to placating or honoring the dangerous forces of nature, a kind of insurance policy carved in stone where hunter-gatherers sought to maintain cosmic balance by acknowledging and respecting the powerful and often threatening animals with whom they shared the landscape, while others interpret the animal imagery as representing different clans or groups or celestial patterns, a symbolic language for organizing social relationships or mapping the heavens onto the terrestrial landscape. Though all such interpretations remain speculative in the absence of any written records or living cultural traditions that might illuminate the symbolic systems of Neolithic Anatolia. What emerges from all these competing theories and interpretations is not a single clear answer to the question of why Göbekli Tepe was built, but rather a growing appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of the people who built it, and a humbling recognition that the distance between us and them is perhaps not as vast as we've imagined, because these were humans with the same cognitive capabilities as us, the same capacity for abstract thought and symbolic reasoning and collective imagination. And if they invested enormous resources into building this place, it's because they believed it mattered, because whatever happened here, whether it was religious worship or astronomical observation or seasonal gatherings or all of these things combined, was important enough to justify the incredible effort required to quarry and transport and erect these massive stones, and to maintain this site across dozens of generations. And the fact that we struggle to understand their motivations says more about the limitations of our own imagination and the provincialism of our own cultural assumptions than it does about the supposed primitiveness of Neolithic thought. The real mystery of Göbekli Tepe isn't just what purpose it served, but what it reveals about human nature itself, about our deep and apparently ancient need to create meaning through monuments, to impose order on chaos through symbols, to connect with something larger than ourselves through ritual and ceremony, and the construction of spaces dedicated to purposes that transcend mere survival. And this need appears to be so fundamental to what makes us human that it predates everything else we consider essential to civilization, suggesting that perhaps the question we should be asking isn't why they built Göbekli Tepe, but rather why we're so surprised that they did, given that the capacity for symbolic thought and the hunger for transcendent meaning seem to be hardwired into human consciousness in ways that we're only beginning to understand after 11,000 years of trying to make sense of ourselves and our place in the cosmos. The strangest chapter in the already bizarre story of Göbekli Tepe begins approximately 1,000 years after the first stones were erected on that wind-swept Turkish hillside, when the people who had maintained and used this sacred site for dozens of generations made a decision so peculiar and so labor-intensive that it baffles archaeologists even more than the original construction. And that decision was to systematically, carefully, methodically bury the entire complex under thousands of tons of earth and debris, transforming what had been an architectural marvel visible for miles around into an artificial hill that would hide these monuments from human eyes for the next 11,000 years. This wasn't abandonment in the ordinary sense, the kind of slow decay that overtakes buildings when their inhabitants simply move away and let nature reclaim the structures through the patient work of wind and rain and vegetation, gradually breaking down what humans had built. Nor was it destruction by enemies who toppled the pillars and scattered the stones in an act of conquest or desecration, but rather something far more intentional and deliberate and utterly mystifying, a conscious act of preservation through burial, as if the builders or their descendants had decided that the best way to honor or protect or conclude the site's purpose was to cover it completely with fill material, creating the rounded hill that gave Göbekli Tepe its modern Turkish name and that kept it hidden until Klaus Schmidt's fateful visit in 1994. The sheer amount of labor involved in this burial process was staggering, arguably rivaling the effort required to build the site in the first place, because filling in those massive circular enclosures and covering those towering pillars required moving countless tons of limestone fragments, soil, and debris. And this material had to be carried or dragged from somewhere else, since there's no evidence of it being excavated from immediate surroundings, meaning that whoever undertook this burial project was committing to years or possibly decades of back-breaking work for the sole purpose of making something disappear, of erasing from the visible landscape a monument that their ancestors had invested generations of effort to create. And this inversion of purpose, building in order to bury, creating in order to conceal, represents a paradox that strikes at the heart of our assumptions about why humans construct monuments in the first place. The archaeological evidence makes clear that this burial was not accidental or gradual, but rather rapid and intentional, because the fill material shows signs of having been deposited in a relatively short period of time rather than accumulating slowly over centuries. And the way the debris was packed into the enclosures suggests careful placement rather than random dumping, almost as if whoever was conducting this burial wanted to ensure that the structures would survive intact, beneath their protective covering of earth, preserved for some future generation that might excavate them, or perhaps preserved for eternity, if the burial was meant to be permanent and final. Some of the enclosures show evidence that they were first carefully filled with smaller stones and debris, creating a kind of protective cushioning around the pillars before the larger fill material was added on top. And this attention to preservation through burial suggests that the people conducting this operation still revered the site even as they were hiding it from view, that they weren't trying to destroy or desecrate Göbekli Tepe, but rather to close it in some ceremonial or symbolic way, to mark the end of its active use while ensuring that the physical structures would survive beneath the earth. The parallels to burial practices used for important human individuals are striking, and perhaps not coincidental, because in many cultures throughout history, burial has been understood as a form of preservation and protection, a way of removing the dead from the corrupting influence of the visible world while keeping them safe for an afterlife, or for some future resurrection. And perhaps the burial of Göbekli Tepe should be understood in similar terms, not as destruction, but as a kind of architectural funeral, a ceremonial closing that honored the site's importance by removing it from the ordinary world and placing it in a liminal space between existence and non-existence, between past and future, between the realm of the living and some other dimension that we can only dimly perceive. The theories attempting to explain why anyone would invest such enormous effort in burying a monument that had taken generations to build range from the practical to the mystical, from the psychologically compelling to the completely speculative. And none of them fully satisfies, because we're trying to understand motivations of people separated from us by 11 millennia of cultural evolution, and whose entire worldview and system of beliefs and understanding of their relationship to the sacred landscape remains fundamentally opaque to modern investigation, despite all our archaeological sophistication and anthropological theorizing. One possibility favored by some researchers is that the burial was protective in nature, that perhaps the people maintaining Göbekli Tepe became aware of approaching enemies or some external threat, and decided that the best way to preserve their sacred site was to hide it completely, burying it so thoroughly that invaders or rivals would never know it existed and therefore could never damage or desecrate it. Though this theory struggles to explain why the burial shows such care and precision rather than the hasty work you'd expect if people were trying to hide something quickly before an enemy army arrived. And it also fails to account for why there's no evidence of the threat that supposedly motivated this drastic action, or why the people who buried the site never returned to excavate it once the danger had passed. Another explanation focuses on environmental or climatic changes, suggesting that perhaps shifting weather patterns or resource availability made it impossible to continue maintaining the site or gathering there for ceremonies, and the burial was a way of formally closing a sacred space that could no longer serve its intended purpose. Though this theory also has gaps because the region around Göbekli Tepe remained inhabited throughout the subsequent millennia, and there's no clear evidence of the kind of catastrophic environmental change that would force a complete abandonment of such an important religious center. More intriguing and perhaps more culturally resonant are the theories that suggest the burial was itself a ritual act, part of the ceremonial life of the site rather than a response to external pressures, and that covering Göbekli Tepe with earth was the final and perhaps most important ceremony, performed there, a closing ritual that transformed the entire complex into a kind of time capsule or sacred offering to forces or entities whose nature we can no longer comprehend. In this interpretation, the 1,000 years of construction and use at Göbekli Tepe might have been building toward this moment of burial all along, working toward some predetermined endpoint when the sacred purpose of the site would be fulfilled, and the proper response would be to remove it from the visible world through ceremonial interment, much like how certain religious traditions call for sacred objects to be buried or destroyed once they've served their purpose, rather than allowing them to be profaned through continued mundane use or decay. The cyclical view of time common to many ancient cultures might support such an interpretation, because if the people who built Göbekli Tepe believed that the cosmos moved in great cycles of creation and destruction, of building up and breaking down, then perhaps they understood that their monument was meant to exist for a specific period before being returned to the earth from which its stones had been quarried, completing a cosmic circle that would have made perfect sense within their symbolic universe, even if it seems bizarre and wasteful to our modern utilitarian sensibilities that measure value primarily in terms of durability and continued use. The most unsettling aspect of the Göbekli Tepe burial, at least from the perspective of anyone trying to understand the development of human civilization in this region, is the realization that becomes unavoidable as you examine the different layers of construction at the site, which is that the oldest structures, the ones buried deepest, constructed earliest in the site's history, dating to that impossibly ancient period around 9600 BCE, are actually the most impressive, the most technically sophisticated, the most elaborately decorated with intricate carvings, and the most precisely aligned with astronomical phenomena, while the later structures built in subsequent centuries show a gradual decline in quality, in size, in artistic ambition, in engineering precision, as if each generation of builders possessed slightly less knowledge, or slightly less skill, or slightly less motivation than the generation before them. This pattern of devolution rather than evolution, of decreasing sophistication over time, rather than the progressive improvement we expect from human technological development, suggests something profoundly disturbing about what Göbekli Tepe represents in the larger story of human cultural development in this region, because it implies that we might be looking not at the beginning of a tradition of monumental architecture, but rather at its end, not at the first flowering of human architectural ambition, but at the last fading echo of something even older, and perhaps even more impressive, that existed before Göbekli Tepe was built, and that had already begun to decline by the time these particular monuments were erected on this Turkish hillside. Consider what this backward progression might mean for our understanding of human prehistory, because if the most ancient structures at Göbekli Tepe represent the highest point of technical achievement, and everything built afterward represents a slow forgetting or abandoning of the knowledge and techniques that made those earliest monuments possible, then perhaps the people who built Göbekli Tepe were themselves inheritors of a tradition they didn't fully understand, keepers of a flame that was already dying when they took up the responsibility of maintaining it. And perhaps the burial of the site was ultimately motivated by the recognition that the knowledge necessary to build and maintain such monuments was being lost, that each generation understood less than the previous one about why these structures mattered, or how to properly care for them, or what rituals should be performed among the pillars, and that rather than let the site decay through neglect, or be repurposed by future generations who would fail to understand its sacred significance, the final keepers of Göbekli Tepe decided to bury it intentionally, preserving it in a state of suspended animation where it could neither be damaged by ignorance nor profaned by misuse. This interpretation casts the burial in a poignant light, transforming it from a mysterious abandonment into a kind of funeral for a dying culture, a last act of reverence performed by people who knew they were living in diminished times compared to the achievements of their distant ancestors, and who chose to protect those ancient accomplishments by removing them from a world that no longer had the wisdom or the will to appreciate them properly. The fact that only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated adds another layer of mystery to the burial question, because we don't yet know what lies beneath the vast majority of the artificial hill that covers the site, and ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have revealed tantalizing hints of additional structures and enclosures still waiting to be uncovered, some of which might be even larger and more elaborate than anything yet excavated, and all of which were buried with the same deliberate care that protected the structures we can now see. The Turkish government has intentionally slowed the pace of excavation, reasoning that future archaeological techniques will be more sophisticated and less destructive than current methods, and that therefore leaving most of the site buried for now is actually the best way to preserve it for future study. Which means that the answers to many of our questions about why Göbekli Tepe was built and why it was buried might remain hidden for decades or even generations, waiting for archaeologists not yet born who will approach the site with tools and methods we haven't invented yet, and theoretical frameworks we haven't yet developed. There's something almost poetic about this modern decision to leave Göbekli Tepe mostly buried, because in a sense we're continuing the work that the ancient builders began when they covered their monuments with earth, protecting the site from too hasty investigation and preserving its mysteries for a future that we hope will be wiser and more capable of understanding what these ancient people were trying to accomplish on their sacred hillside 11,000 years ago. The burial of Göbekli Tepe also raises uncomfortable questions about how many other sites might exist in similar conditions, buried either deliberately or accidentally beneath millennia of accumulated soil and sediment, waiting for someone with Klaus Schmidt's combination of knowledge and intuition and persistence to recognize them for what they are and begin the slow work of excavation. Because if Göbekli Tepe could hide in plain sight for 11,000 years, dismissed as a Byzantine cemetery even after archaeologists had examined it in the 1960s, then how many other monuments to prehistoric sophistication might still be scattered across the landscape, their existence unsuspected because they don't fit our expectations about what Neolithic people were capable of building? Or because we've become too confident in our understanding of human prehistory to seriously entertain the possibility that we might have missed something important? The deliberate burial transforms Göbekli Tepe from an isolated anomaly into potentially just the most visible example of a broader pattern. And it forces us to wonder whether the people who built this site also built other monuments elsewhere that they similarly buried when their time came to an end, creating a hidden archaeology of the Neolithic period that exists beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered and to once again upend everything we think we know about the capabilities and achievements of our ancestors in the millennia before written history began. When you stand at Göbekli Tepe today, looking out across the harsh beauty of the Anatolian plateau, where winter winds still howl across landscapes that have changed remarkably little since the last ice age ended, and spring still brings the same wildflowers that ancient hunter-gatherers would have seen blooming among the grasses their ancestors harvested before anyone had conceived of deliberately planting seeds, you find yourself confronting a question that extends far beyond the specific mystery of this one archaeological site and touches instead on something fundamental about human nature and human history and the stories we tell ourselves about our journey from the caves to the skyscrapers. The question is this: what if everything we've believed about the linear progression of human civilization, from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, from ignorant to enlightened, is not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong? And what if Göbekli Tepe isn't an anomaly or an outlier or a strange exception to the general rules of human development, but rather evidence of a pattern we've been too arrogant or too invested in our own narratives to recognize? A pattern of rises and falls, of knowledge gained and lost, of sophistication that appears and flourishes and then vanishes, leaving only mysterious monuments behind to puzzle the archaeologists of later ages who discover them and struggle to reconcile their existence with comfortable theories about how human progress is supposed to work. For more than a century, the dominant narrative of human history has been reassuringly straightforward. a story of steady upward progress from our origins as tool-using primates to our current status as the masters of a technological civilization that can split atoms and sequence genomes and send robots to explore other planets. And this narrative assumes that each generation builds upon the achievements of previous generations, that knowledge accumulates rather than disappears, that the overall trajectory is always upward, even if there are occasional setbacks or temporary dark ages, and that we, modern humans, represent the pinnacle of this developmental process. The most advanced and most capable humans who have ever lived, standing on the shoulders of countless previous generations who each contributed their small part to the edifice of human knowledge and capability that we've inherited. Göbekli Tepe takes this comfortable story and sets it on fire, because here we have evidence of people 11,000 years ago organizing labor on a massive scale, quarrying and transporting multi-ton stones, carving intricate symbolic representations of their cosmological understanding, aligning monuments with celestial phenomena, maintaining complex religious or ceremonial practices across multiple generations, and then deliberately burying the whole thing in what might have been the final act of a cultural tradition that subsequently vanished so completely that we had no idea it had ever existed until a German archaeologist happened to kick the right rock while walking across a Turkish hillside in 1994, and this pattern, sophistication followed by disappearance, achievement followed by forgetting, suggests that human history might be far messier and more cyclical than we've wanted to admit, with knowledge rising and falling like tides, with capabilities appearing and vanishing, and sometimes reappearing millennia later, as if they were being independently reinvented by people who had no connection to or knowledge of previous achievements. The implications of Göbekli Tepe become even more provocative and controversial when you start asking the obvious follow-up question that any rational person should ask when confronted with evidence of sophisticated prehistoric culture, which is, if they could build this, what else could they build? And if we only discovered this site because it happened to be buried in a way that preserved it, and because one particularly persistent archaeologist refused to accept the conventional wisdom that it was just a Byzantine cemetery, then how many other Göbekli Tepes might still be hidden beneath the earth, buried either deliberately like this one or accidentally through the slow accumulation of sediment and soil over millennia, waiting to be discovered by future generations who might have better tools or better theories or better luck than we do? This question leads directly into territory that makes mainstream archaeologists extremely uncomfortable, because it flirts with the kinds of speculation that have been enthusiastically embraced by pseudo-scientific writers and sensationalist documentaries that claim evidence for lost civilizations and ancient advanced technologies, and all sorts of claims that serious scholars rightfully reject as unsupported by evidence. But the uncomfortable truth is that Göbekli Tepe has already proven that, at least, some of what we dismissed as impossible claims about prehistoric sophistication were actually true, that people without writing or metal or agriculture were in fact capable of engineering and organizational feats that we confidently declared they could not have accomplished. And if we were wrong about that, then perhaps we should approach other supposedly impossible claims with a bit more humility and a bit less certainty that our current understanding of prehistory is complete and accurate. The debate over lost civilizations has always been contentious, pitting mainstream academics who insist that we have a reasonably complete understanding of human cultural development against alternative researchers who argue that there's evidence for sophisticated prehistoric cultures that existed before the rise of the earliest known civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley. And Göbekli Tepe has complicated this debate considerably because it demonstrates that monumental architecture and complex symbolic thinking existed much earlier than mainstream archaeology previously acknowledged, which lends at least some credibility to the idea that other aspects of human cultural sophistication might also have emerged earlier than we've believed. The question is no longer whether prehistoric people could have built impressive monuments. Göbekli Tepe proves they could, but rather how widespread such achievements were. How much knowledge and capability has been lost to the erosion of time and the accidents of preservation, and how many other sites remain undiscovered because they exist in places we haven't looked, or because they've been so thoroughly destroyed or buried that they've left no visible trace on the modern landscape, waiting for some combination of new technology and old-fashioned archaeological persistence to reveal their existence to a world that has forgotten they ever existed. The parallel between Göbekli Tepe and our own civilization becomes uncomfortably clear when you start thinking about what would survive if our technological society collapsed tomorrow. If some combination of climate disaster or nuclear war or pandemic or economic collapse or any of the other existential threats that keep futurists and risk analysts awake at night actually came to pass, and human civilization regressed to a pre-industrial or even pre-agricultural state, losing most of the knowledge and infrastructure and institutional structures that make modern life possible. What would archaeologists 11,000 years from now find when they excavated the ruins of our cities? And would they be able to reconstruct an accurate picture of our capabilities and achievements from the scattered artifacts and degraded structures that survived the millennia of weathering and decay and geological change? Most of what we consider the pinnacle of human achievement, our computer networks and satellite systems and genetic databases and accumulated scientific knowledge, exists in forms that are remarkably fragile and dependent on continuous maintenance and institutional support, stored on magnetic media that degrades within decades or in electronic systems that require constant power and periodic updating to remain accessible. And if those support systems failed, most of our digital civilization would simply evaporate, leaving future archaeologists with nothing but the physical structures we've built and whatever artifacts happen to be made of materials durable enough to survive millennia of exposure to the elements. The Göbekli Tepe stones have survived 11,000 years because they're massive and they're made of limestone, and they were buried in a way that protected them from the worst effects of weathering. But our modern skyscrapers and bridges and dams, despite being far larger and more technically impressive than anything the Neolithic builders of Gobekli Tepe accomplished, are actually less likely to survive for millennia because they're made of steel and concrete and glass, materials that corrode and crumble and shatter far more quickly than solid stone when left unmaintained, and within a few thousand years, most of our cities would be reduced to mysterious mounds of rubble that future archaeologists might excavate and puzzle over, trying to reconstruct what kind of society could have built such things and what happened to cause their disappearance. Perhaps those future archaeologists would look at the ruins of our civilization and confidently declare that primitive 21st century humans couldn't possibly have built such structures, couldn't possibly have possessed the knowledge and organizational capacity required for such achievements. And perhaps they would dismiss evidence of our technological sophistication as impossible or fraudulent because it doesn't fit their theories about how human cultural development is supposed to proceed, making the same mistakes of assumption and arrogance that prevented us from recognizing Göbekli Tepe for what it was when we first encountered it in the 1960s, and confidently dismissed it as nothing more than a medieval cemetery, unworthy of further investigation. The profound and humbling truth that Göbekli Tepe forces us to confront is that the people who built this monument 11,000 years ago were not primitive versions of humanity, not some early draft of what humans would eventually become after another 10 millennia of cultural evolution and technological development, but rather were fully modern humans with the same cognitive capabilities as us, the same capacity for abstract thought and symbolic reasoning and creative problem-solving and emotional depth and social complexity. And the primary difference between them and us is not in our fundamental nature or our intellectual capacity, but rather in the specific knowledge and technologies and institutional structures that we've happened to inherit or develop in the intervening millennia. They were us, separated by time but not by any fundamental difference in capability or consciousness. And if they could conceive and execute a construction project as ambitious as Göbekli Tepe, using only stone tools and human muscle and whatever organizational structures their society had developed, then we should perhaps be more cautious about declaring what ancient peoples could or couldn't have accomplished based solely on our assumptions about what technologies and social structures they possessed, because Göbekli Tepe proves that those assumptions have been wrong before and might well be wrong again. The site sits there still on its Turkish hillside, mostly unexcavated, with 95% of its secrets still buried beneath the artificial mound that ancient hands created to protect or preserve or ceremonially close this sacred space. And the Turkish government's decision to slow excavation and leave most of the site untouched for future generations represents a kind of wisdom that the original builders might have appreciated. A recognition that some mysteries are worth preserving rather than rushing to solve, that patience and careful planning are virtues worth cultivating, even in an age that values instant gratification and rapid results. The structures that remain buried might be even more impressive than those already uncovered, might reveal even more about the capabilities and beliefs and organizational sophistication of the people who built this place, might force us to revise our understanding of prehistory even more dramatically than we've already had to do in the 3 decades since Klaus Schmidt recognized these limestone fragments for what they actually were. Or they might simply confirm what we've already learned, which is that our ancestors were capable of far more than we've given them credit for, and that the story of human civilization is far more complex and cyclical and mysterious than the simple, linear narrative of progress that we've constructed to make sense of our journey from the caves to the present moment. Perhaps the real lesson of Göbekli Tepe isn't about the specific people who built it or the particular reasons they had for undertaking such an ambitious project, or even the question of what other lost achievements might still be waiting to be discovered beneath the soil of continents where humans have lived and built and created for hundreds of thousands of years, but rather something more fundamental about the relationship between knowledge and time, about how human accomplishments can rise and fall and sometimes vanish so completely that later generations have no idea they ever existed, and about the profound arrogance of assuming that we moderns have reached some permanent plateau of advancement that our ancestors could never have approached. The monument stands there, or rather lies buried there, as a permanent reminder that we don't know nearly as much as we think we do about human prehistory, about the capabilities of our ancestors, about the full scope of human achievement across the vast span of time that separates us from the first anatomically modern humans who emerged in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago and gradually spread across the planet, building and creating and thinking and dreaming in ways that have left only fragmentary traces for us to puzzle over. Göbekli Tepe forces us to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in our minds simultaneously. First, that human cultural and technological development has indeed progressed in many ways from the Neolithic to the present, that we have accumulated knowledge and capabilities that those ancient builders could not have possessed. And second, that this progress has not been linear or inevitable or permanent, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that sophisticated cultures can vanish, leaving only mysterious ruins behind, that the people we dismissively label as primitive were in many ways our equals in intelligence and creativity and determination, and that the primary advantage we possess over them is not superior capability, but merely the accident of having been born into a civilization that has managed, so far, to avoid the kind of catastrophic collapse that erased whatever culture or tradition produced Göbekli Tepe, and then buried it beneath the earth, where it would wait for 11,000 years to deliver its message to a future generation, finally ready to hear what it has to say about the deep history of human achievement and the fragility of everything we build, and the eternal human hunger to create monuments that will outlast our brief individual lives and speak to distant futures about who we were and what we believed, and what we thought was important enough to justify the investment of years and decades and generations of back-breaking labor in service of purposes that transcended mere survival and reached toward something eternal.